Dust devils danced a mournful jig on the parched earth, mimicking the chaotic ballet of death unfolding outside the Broken Spur saloon. Ethan, his face a granite mask etched with the map of hard living, pushed Sarah lower behind the overturned water trough. The setting sun, a crimson gash across the horizon, painted the scene in shades of blood and fire. It was a fitting backdrop for desperation's first stand. Gunfire ripped through the air, a ragged symphony of destruction. Ethan's Colt Peacemaker barked back, each shot precise, economical, a testament to years spent honing survival into an art. Sarah, her thin frame trembling, clung to his worn leather coat, her knuckles white. "Don't leave me, Ethan," she whispered, a plea swallowed by the roar. He didn't answer with words. Words were a luxury they couldn't afford. His answer was the solid wall of his body, the unwavering focus in his steely blue eyes, the grim set of his jaw as he reloaded, the metallic click, a counterpoint to the panicked drumming of her heart. He'd made promises before, promises he'd broken. This one, the unspoken vow etched in the grit of his soul, he intended to keep. The men laying siege were led by Jedediah Stone, a land grabber with a smile like a viper and a reputation stained crimson. He wanted the deed to the small plot of land Ethan and Sarah called home, land their pa had bled and sweated for, land that held the promise of a future Sarah deserved. Pa was gone now, buried beneath a weathered wooden cross on a windswept hill. Stone figured a grieving orphan girl was easy pickings. He figured wrong. Ethan had known this day was coming. He'd seen the hunger in Stone's eyes, the avarice that twisted his features into a grotesque parody of humanity. He'd spent the last few weeks fortifying the old homestead, teaching Sarah how to shoot, how to survive. He'd hoped it wouldn't come to this. He'd hoped Stone would find some semblance of decency buried deep within his blackened heart. Hope, he knew, was a fool's errand in this godforsaken land. A bullet whizzed past Ethan's ear, kicking up splinters from the trough. He spat, the taste of dust and gunpowder bitter on his tongue. Sarah flinched, burying her face in his arm. He felt her tears soak into his sleeve, a silent accusation, a reminder of his failures, his inability to protect her from the harsh realities of their existence. He tightened his grip on the Colt, the cold steel of familiar comfort. He wouldn't fail her again. Not this time. He wouldn't let Stone steal her future, her hope, her life. He'd die first. The air hung thick and heavy, shimmering with heat. The only sound was the creak of the wagon wheels and the rhythmic plod of the mare, Bess, pulling them deeper into the unforgiving embrace of the desert. Ethan sat ramrod straight, his gaze fixed on the horizon, a hawk searching for prey. Sarah huddled beside him, her eyes wide and haunted, the echo of gunfire still ringing in her ears. They'd left the Broken Spur under cover of darkness, leaving behind the ghosts of their past, the charred remnants of their dreams. The homestead, their pa's legacy, was gone, claimed by the flames of Stone's malice. All that remained was the wagon, Bess, and the clothes on their backs. And Ethan, her shield, her protector. The brother who had always been her anchor in a storm. He hadn't said a word since they'd left. His silence wasn't indifference, Sarah knew. It was the silence of a man burdened, a man wrestling with demons she couldn't fully comprehend. She saw the lines etched deeper into his face, the way his hand never strayed far from the Colt, strapped to his thigh. He carried the weight of their past, the responsibility for their future, on his broad shoulders. She knew the truth of it, the unspoken horror that fueled Stone's obsession. It wasn't just the land he craved. It was her. He'd made his intentions clear, his leering gaze leaving her feeling soiled and vulnerable. Pa had always shielded her from men like Stone, men who saw women as property, as objects to be used and discarded. After Pa died, Ethan had stepped into the breach, a silent guardian against the darkness that lurked in the hearts of men. He hadn't said it outright, but she knew why he'd taught her to shoot. It wasn't just about survival in the Wild West. It was about giving her the power to protect herself, the agency to choose her own destiny. A destiny Stone had tried to steal with his oily words and grasping hands. The landscape stretched before them, a canvas of browns and reds, broken only by the occasional scraggly bush or towering mesa. It was a harsh, unforgiving land, a reflection of the battles Ethan fought within himself. Scars, Sarah knew, ran deeper than the surface. She'd seen the way he flinched in his sleep, the haunted look in his eyes when he thought she wasn't watching. He carried wounds from a past he rarely spoke of, a past that had hardened him, forged him into the man he was today. She reached into the water skin, offering it to him. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper above the creaking of the wagon. "You need to drink." He didn't look at her. He simply took the skin, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. He tilted his head back, the water gurgling down his throat, washing away the dust and the bitterness. He finished, handed the skin back to her, and returned his gaze to the horizon. No words of thanks, no acknowledgement of her presence. Just the silence, the vast, echoing silence of the West. But in that silence, Sarah heard a promise of protection, of loyalty, of unwearying devotion. And in that promise, she found a sliver of hope, a fragile ember glowing in the darkness. The sun beat down on them, relentless and unforgiving, baking the cracked earth to a fever pitch. Hours bled into each other, marked only by the slow crawl of Bess and the gnawing emptiness in Sarah's stomach. Just when her hope threatened to wither entirely, a smudge appeared on the horizon. A cluster of buildings, barely clinging to existence, but buildings nonetheless. "Ethan," she croaked, her voice raspy. "What is it?" He followed her gaze, his eyes narrowed against the glare. A muscle ticked in his jaw. "Claim," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Abandoned, last I heard." As they drew closer, the smudge resolved into a derelict farmhouse, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin, a sagging porch offering a meager invitation. A skeletal windmill stood sentinel, its blades frozen in a silent scream. Despite the disrepair, a wisp of smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a beacon in the desolate landscape. Hope, fragile as a newborn bird, fluttered in Sarah's chest. A roof over their heads, a place to rest, a chance to rebuild. Ethan had promised her a safe haven, a place where she could start anew. This perhaps was it. But the hope dimmed as they pulled the wagon to a halt before the farmhouse. The silence was heavy, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the distant cry of a hawk. No welcoming party emerged. No friendly faces peered from the windows. An unsettling stillness permeated the air. Ethan climbed down, his hand instinctively resting on the butt of his Colt. He scanned the surroundings, his senses on high alert. Sarah followed, her steps hesitant. She clutched the worn shawl tighter around her shoulders, a pathetic attempt to ward off the chill that had settled deep in her bones. The front door creaked open, revealing a woman framed in the doorway. Her face was gaunt, her eyes guarded, her expression a mixture of suspicion and weariness. 4 other women stood behind her, their faces mirroring hers. They were a study in hardship, their clothes patched and faded, their hands calloused and rough. "What do you want?" the woman in the doorway asked, her voice flat and devoid of warmth. Ethan stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "We're looking for shelter," he said, his voice low and steady. "Heard this place was abandoned." The woman's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "Abandoned by some, occupied by others," she said. "We're making do." Sarah felt her heart sink. This wasn't the haven Ethan had promised. This was someone else's haven, a fragile sanctuary already claimed. She saw the flicker of disappointment in Ethan's eyes, the way his shoulders slumped slightly. He'd made a promise he couldn't keep. "My name is Maggie," the woman continued, her gaze sweeping over them. "And these are my sisters. We don't have much to spare." Ethan nodded slowly, his silence speaking volumes. He knew the code of the West, the unspoken rules of survival. You didn't intrude on another's territory, especially when they were barely scraping by themselves. He looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with a mixture of apology and resolve. He'd brought her here, fueled by a desperate hope, only to find another dead end. The weight of his responsibility pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. "We understand," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We'll move on." But Sarai couldn't bear it. She couldn't face another night under the open ski sky, another day of relentless sun and gnawing hunger. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "Please," she pleaded, her eyes meeting Maggie's. "We don't need much, just a corner to sleep in, a bit of water. We can work. We're not afraid of hard work." Maggie studied her, her gaze assessing, unblinking. Sarah felt exposed, vulnerable, like a lamb offered to the wolves. She held her breath, waiting for the verdict. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, pregnant with uncertainty. Maggie's gaze lingered on Ethan, dissecting him like a butcher eyeing a carcass. The set of his jaw, the calluses on his hands, the quiet strength that radiated from him, despite his worn appearance. She saw it all. He was a man who knew hardship, a man who could handle himself. And she desperately needed a man who could handle himself. "All right," she said, her voice grudging. "You can stay, but not for free." Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. He expected nothing less. Charity was a rare commodity in this land, and he wasn't one to take handouts. "We're running a different kind of operation here," Maggie continued, her eyes darting nervously towards the other women. "We ain't farmers. We ain't got much use for plowing or planting." Sarah's brow furrowed. The land surrounding the claim was barren, unsuitable for crops. So what did these women do? "We got a small herd," Maggie said, as if reading Sarah's mind. "A few head of cattle, some scrawny goats. Enough to keep us fed, barely. But rustlers, they've been sniffing around. Bold as brass they are. Need someone to keep them honest." Ethan's eyes narrowed. Cattle rustling, a common enough problem in the West, but one that could quickly turn deadly. He knew his way around cattle, had spent years wrangling steers and branding calves under the blistering sun of the Texas plains. He was no stranger to violence either. "I can handle that," he said, his voice low and steady. Maggie studied him for another long moment, then nodded, a flicker of something akin to relief crossing her face. "All right, you keep our stock safe. You get a roof over your head and a share of the grub. Fair enough?" "Fair enough," Ethan replied. Sarah watched them, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. This arrangement felt precarious. They were stepping into a situation fraught with danger, relying on the goodwill of strangers in a land where trust was a luxury few could afford. But what choice did they have? Maggie gestured towards a dilapidated shack at the edge of the property. "You can bunk there," she said. "It ain't much, but it's dry." Ethan inclined his head in acknowledgement. He unloaded their meager belongings from the wagon, his movements economical and efficient. Sarah helped him, her silence mirroring his. They were both aware of the unspoken tension hanging heavy in the air, the unspoken questions that lingered between them. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the parched landscape, Ethan surveyed the property. The claim was isolated, vulnerable, an easy target for anyone with a grudge or a thirst for profit. The cattle were indeed scrawny, a motley collection of longhorns and Herefords, their ribs showing through their dusty hides. The goats were even worse, a scraggly bunch that looked like they hadn't seen a decent meal in months. It was a far cry from the lush pastures and sprawling ranches he'd known in his younger days. But it was a start, a chance to rebuild, to protect Sarah, to carve out a future from the unforgiving earth. He glanced at Sarah, her face pale and drawn in the fading light. He saw the fear in her eyes, the uncertainty that mirrored his own. He walked over to her, his hand gently cupping her cheek. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His touch, his gaze, conveyed everything he couldn't put into words. He would protect her. He would keep her safe. He would not let this place, this precarious haven, be taken from them. He would stand against the darkness, even if it meant facing it alone. The West demanded a price for every inch of kindness. Ethan knew he was about to pay it. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, chasing away the lingering shadows of night. Ethan was already awake, the scent of wood smoke clinging to his clothes. He'd risen before the sun, eager to start the day, to prove his worth to Maggie and the other women. He found a rusty axe leaning against the shack and set to work, splitting fallen branches into firewood. The rhythmic thud of the axe against the wood echoed through the stillness, a counterpoint to the chirping of the awakening birds. The women emerged from the farmhouse as the sun climbed higher, their faces etched with the weariness of countless hard days. Maggie nodded curtly at Ethan, her gaze assessing. She wasn't a woman of many words, but her eyes spoke volumes. They held a mixture of suspicion, gratitude, and a quiet determination. He spent the morning mending fences, patching holes with scraps of wood and wire. The cattle, sensing the renewed boundaries, grazed contentedly within the repaired enclosure. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his movements honed by years of working the land. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke louder than any boast. Sarah, meanwhile, found herself drawn to Maggie's side. The older woman tended a small garden near the farmhouse, a patch of green amidst the arid landscape. It was a meager garden, struggling to survive in the harsh climate, but it represented a lifeline, a source of sustenance and hope. Maggie showed Sarah how to water the plants, how to weed the stubborn soil, how to coax life from the parched earth. Sarah's hands, once accustomed to finer things, quickly adapted to the rough labor. She found solace in the repetitive tasks, a sense of purpose in nurturing the fragile seedlings. The garden became her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the memories of the past and dream of a brighter future. The days bled into weeks, marked by the relentless sun and the constant struggle for survival. Ethan worked from dawn till dusk, his muscles aching, his hands calloused and raw. He cleared rocks from the fields, preparing the land for planting. He repaired the dilapidated windmill, hoping to restore its ability to draw water from the depths of the earth. He patrolled the perimeter of the claim, his colt always at his side, his ceases on high alert for any sign of rustlers. Sarah worked alongside Maggie, learning the rhythms of the garden, the secrets of the land. She discovered a hidden strength within herself, a resilience she never knew she possessed. She found a quiet camaraderie with the other women, a shared understanding of their hardships and their hopes. There was a scant understanding growing between them all, a font forged in the crucible of shared labor and mutual dependence. They were a motley crew, bound together by circumstance, but they were united in their determination to survive, to build a better life from the ruins of the past. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, Ethan and Sarah sat on the porch of the shack, watching the cattle graze peacefully in the distance. The air was still and quiet, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. Sarah leaned her head against Ethan's shoulder, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She didn't speak, but her touch conveyed her gratitude, her trust, her love. He didn't need words either. He knew what she was thinking, what she was feeling. They had been through so much together, faced so many hardships that words were often unnecessary. He looked out at the land, at the cattle, at the farmhouse in the distance. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. A place to call home, a place to rebuild, a place to find peace. He knew the challenges that lay ahead were daunting. The threats were real. But he was ready. He would face them head on, with courage and determination. He would protect Sarah. He would protect this claim. He would protect the fragile hope that had begun to blossom in the heart of the West. The silence was broken when he finally spoke, his voice low and raspy. "We'll make it, Sarah. We will." The promise hung in the air, as tangible as the dust that swirled around their boots. The peace of the evening was shattered a few nights later. Sarah was asleep, her breathing soft and even beside him in the narrow bunk. Ethan lay awake, staring at the rough-hewn timbers of the shack, his mind still churning over the day's work, the persistent feeling of unease clinging to him like a burr. He heard it, then. A murmur of voices drifting from the main house carried on the cool night air. He strained his ears, curiosity piqued. He wasn't one for eavesdropping, but something about the hushed tones, the urgency in their voices, pulled him from his reverie. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Sarah. He padded barefoot to the shack's only window, a grimy pane of glass, offering a distorted view of the farmhouse. The light was dim, only a single lamp burning low inside, but he could make out the silhouettes of Maggie and her sisters gathered around the kitchen table. He pressed his ear against the glass, the voices becoming clearer now, though still muffled. He could pick out fragments of sentences, whispered words that sent a chill down his spine. "Debt. Can't keep putting it off." That was Maggie, her voice tight with worry. "He'll take everything, the cattle, the land." Another sister, her voice trembling. "Gold, only wait, to pay him off." This voice was low, almost a hiss. Gold. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. He strained to hear more, piecing together the fragments of their conversation. They spoke of a hidden stash, carefully accumulated over years of hardship. Gold meant to buy them freedom, to secure their future. But from whom? What debt were they so desperate to rape? He heard the name then, spoken in a hushed whisper that made his blood run cold. Callahan. Ethan knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew the name. Silas Callahan was a ruthless land baron, a man who built his empire on intimidation and violence. He controlled vast tracts of land, his influence reaching into every corner of the West. He was a man to be feared, a man who wouldn't hesitate to crush anyone who stood in his way. The pieces began to fall into place, the isolation of the claim, the women's guarded demeanor, the rustlers sniffing around. It all pointed to Callahan. He was after their land, their cattle, everything they had. And the women were desperate to protect it, willing to risk everything to keep him at bay. Ethan stepped back from the window. His mind racing. The revelation changed everything. He was no longer just protecting a few head of cattle and a dilapidated farmhouse. He was caught in the middle of a dangerous game, a power struggle between desperate women and a ruthless land baron. He looked back at the shack, at the sleeping form of Sarah. He had brought her here seeking refuge, a safe haven from the dangers of the world. But now, he realized, he had led her straight into the lion's den. He paced the small confines of the shack, his mind wrestling with the implications. He could walk away, pack up their belongings, and disappear into the vastness of the West. It was the safest option, the most sensible course of action. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. He had given his word to Maggie, promised to protect their stock. And more importantly, he couldn't abandon Sarah, leave her vulnerable to Callahan's reach. He stopped pacing, sighing, his jaw set in grim determination. He would stay. He would protect Sarah, and he would help these women defend their claim, even if it meant facing Callahan himself. But he couldn't trust them completely. They had kept their secret from him, concealed the true extent of their predicament. He needed to know more, to understand the full scope of the danger they faced. He needed to find the gold, to assess the risks, to formulate a plan. He knew he was walking a dangerous path, venturing into territory where trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. But he had no choice. He was a protector, a guardian. And he wouldn't let Callahan or anyone else harm the woman he had sworn to keep safe. The silence was broken only by the soft breathing of Sarah, a reminder of what was at stake. The news came with the dawn, delivered by Maggie's curt voice rapping on the shack door. Ethan was already awake, sharpening his knife by the faint light, filtering through the cracks in the wood. Cora Thracer stirred beside him, her eyes heavy with sleep. "We're taking the herd to market," Maggie stated, her gaze fixed on Ethan. "Leave at first light." Ethan nodded slowly, his mind already calculating the distance, the potential dangers, the logistics of moving a herd of scrawny cattle across miles of open range. It was a gamble, exposing their meager wealth to the risks of rustlers and Callahan's watchful eyes. "I'll go," he said, his voice low and steady, "but on one condition." Maggie's eyebrows rose slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. She wasn't accustomed to being challenged, to having her decisions questioned. "And what's that?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "Sarah doesn't stay here alone," Ethan replied, his gaze unwavering. "She comes with us." Maggie hesitated, her eyes darting towards Sarah, then back to Ethan. She clearly hadn't anticipated this request. Leaving Sarah behind would be simpler, less complicated. But she also understood Ethan's concern, the vulnerability of leaving a woman alone in this harsh and unforgiving land. "All right," she conceded finally, her voice grudging. "She can come, but she pulls her weight." Ethan nodded, satisfied. He knew Sarah could handle herself. She was stronger than she looked, more resilient than she realized. The sun was barely cresting the horizon when they set out, the cattle lowing and jostling as they were herded from the makeshift corral. Ethan rode at the head of the small procession, his eyes scanning the landscape, his senses on high alert. Maggie and her sisters flanked the herd, their faces grim and determined. Sarah rode beside Ethan, her hand resting on the butt of the revolver tucked into her waistband. The air was still and heavy, the silence broken only by the rhythmic thud of hooves and the occasional bawl of a cow. The sun beat down mercilessly, baking the earth and turning the air into a shimmering haze. The landscape stretched out before them, an endless expanse of parched grasslands and rocky hills. The cattle were slow and stubborn, resistant to the heat and the dust. They moved at a snail's pace, their ribs showing through their dusty hides. It was a grueling journey, a test of endurance and patience. As the day wore on, the tension grew thicker, the silence more oppressive. Ethan could feel Maggie's eyes on him, scrutinizing his every move. He knew she still didn't trust him completely, that she was wary of his intentions. He understood her suspicion. Trust was a rare commodity in this land, earned through deeds, not words. He would prove himself to her, show her that he was worthy of her trust. He would protect her cattle. He would protect Sarah. And he would help her face whatever dangers lay ahead. The weight of the unspoken promise settled on his shoulders as the sun climbed higher, baking the dry earth beneath them. The cattle drive had begun, and with it, a battle for trust. The sun was a molten coin hammered into the sky when the ambush hit. One moment, the only sound was the mournful lowing of the cattle. The next, the air erupted in gunfire and the panicked bellows of startled beasts. Riders materialized from the scrub brush and rocky outcrops, their faces masked by bandana waffes, their rifles spitting lead. Ethan reacted instinctively. He shoved Sarah behind the relative cover of a rocky outcropping and drew his Colt. The familiar weight, a comfort in the chaos. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the screams of wounded cattle. What surprised him wasn't the attack itself, but the ferocity with which Maggie and her sisters met it. These weren't just homesteaders defending their property. They were seasoned fighters. Maggie, her face a mask of grim determination, wielded a Winchester rifle with deadly accuracy, dropping one of the attackers from his saddle with a single shot. Her sisters, equally adept, unleashed a hail of gunfire, forcing the remaining bandits to take cover. Ethan fought alongside them, his movements economical and precise. He took aim, squeezed the trigger, and watched as another rider tumbled from his horse. He moved with a practiced grace, years of handling a firearm ingrained in his muscle memory. The initial volley had broken the momentum of the attack. The bandits, taken aback by the women's unexpected resistance, hesitated. Ethan seized the opportunity, urging Sarah to stay low as he moved forward, flanking the attackers. The fight was short and brutal. The bandits, realizing they were outmatched, scattered and fled, disappearing back into the scrub brush as quickly as they had appeared. The dust settled, leaving behind a scene of carnage. Cattle lay bleeding on the ground, their moans echoing through the stillness. The air was thick with the smell of death and gunpowder. Maggie and her sisters moved among the fallen cattle, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and grim satisfaction. They were efficient and methodical, quickly assessing the damage and tending to the wounded animals. Ethan watched them, a knot of suspicion tightening in his gut. Their response had been too swift, too coordinated. They had been ready for the attack, almost as if they had known it was coming. He approached Maggie, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Who knew we were bringing the cattle to market?" he asked, his voice low and even. Maggie hesitated, her eyes flickered away from his, a telltale sign of deception. "Just us," she said finally, her voice tight, "and maybe a few folks in town." Ethan didn't believe her. The attack had been too precise, too well-timed. Someone had known exactly when and where to strike. Someone had betrayed them. "Someone talked," he said, his voice flat. "Someone knew we were coming." Maggie remained silent, her gaze fixed on the ground. The truth hung in the air between them, unspoken, but undeniable. Ethan knew then that he was caught in a web of secrets and lies, that the women he had sworn to protect were hiding something from him. He looked at Sarah, her face pale with shock, her eyes wide with fear. He had brought her into this, exposed her to this violence. He had to protect her, not just from the bandits, but from the secrets and deceptions that threatened to tear them apart. The sun beat down on the bloody ground, the heat intensifying the stench of death. Ethan knew the cattle drive would continue, but now it carried the weight of suspicion and distrust. The ambush had not only revealed the dangers of the West, but also the treachery that could lurk within. They returned to the farm under the long shadows of the setting sun, the remaining cattle limping, their spirits broken. The air was thick with exhaustion and unspoken accusations. Ethan unsaddled his horse in silence, his movements stiff and deliberate. Sarah helped him, her touch light, her eyes filled with concern. Maggie and her sisters tended to the wounded cattle, their faces grim. The attack had taken its toll, not just on their stock, but on their resolve. The dream of selling their cattle for a fair price, of buying themselves some breathing room, seemed further away than ever. After the cattle were settled as best they could, Ethan found Maggie tending a wounded calf, its leg twisted at an unnatural angle. He approached her slowly, his boots crunching on the dry earth. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the quiet. Maggie didn't look up. She continued to examine the calf's leg, her brow furrowed in concentration. "We're all tired, Ethan. Can't it wait?" "No," he replied, his voice firm. "It can't." She sighed, finally meeting his gaze. Her eyes were guarded, wary. What is it? The ambush, he said, his gaze unwavering. Someone knew we were coming. Someone told them. Maggie's face hardened. I told you. It was probably just someone in town. That's not good enough, Ethan countered, his voice raising slightly. It was too precise. They knew exactly when and where to hit us. Someone betrayed you. Maggie turned away, her back to him. I don't know what you want me to say, Ethan. We didn't tell anyone. Maybe we were just unlucky. Unlucky, Ethan scoffed. 3 riders knew exactly when a small herd would be passing through a desolate patch of land. That's not luck, Maggie. That's inside information. He paused, letting his words sink in. Who else knew about the gold? He asked, changing tack abruptly. Maggie stiffened. What gold? She asked, her voice sharp, defensive. Don't play coy with me, Maggie, Ethan said, his patience wearing thin. I heard you talking. I know about Callahan, about the debt you owe him, about the gold you're hiding. Maggie's face paled. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape route. Sarah, who had been watching from the doorway of the shack, stepped forward. Ethan, please, she said, her voice pleading. Don't do this. Ethan ignored her, his gaze fixed on Maggie. Who else knows, Maggie? Who else knows about the gold and Callahan? Maggie remained silent, her jaw clenched tight. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. It doesn't matter. Knowing won't change anything. It matters to me, Ethan said, his voice firm. I risked my life to protect your cattle, to protect Sarah. I deserve to know the truth. He stepped closer, his presence looming over her. Who else, Maggie? Tell me. Maggie's shoulders slumped in defeat. She looked at Ethan, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resentment. Just us, she said finally, her voice receded. Just me and my sisters. That's all. Ethan didn't believe her. He saw the flicker of deception in her eyes, the hesitation in her voice. He knew she was still hiding something, that the truth was more complicated than she was letting on. He looked at Sarah, her face etched with worry. He had promised to protect her, but he was beginning to realize that he couldn't protect her from everything. He couldn't protect her from the secrets and lies that were woven into the fabric of this land, into the lives of these women. He turned and walked away, leaving Maggie kneeling beside the wounded calf, her face hidden in the shadows. He knew he couldn't trust her completely, but he also knew he couldn't abandon her. He was caught in a web of obligations and promises, bound to these women by a shared sense of danger and a growing sense of responsibility. As he walked towards the shack, Sarah caught up to him, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. Ethan, please, she said, her voice soft. Don't push them too hard. They're scared. Ethan stopped and looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and affection. They're more than scared, Sarah, he said, his voice rough. They're lying, and those lies could get us all killed. He didn't elaborate, just turned and entered the shack. The single room was small, lit by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. He sat on the edge of the cot, pulling off his boots, the silence spoken only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Sarah sat beside him, her hand resting on his. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know, he admitted. I need to figure out who they were protecting, what they are so afraid of. He looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with concern. Are you all right? He asked. You were close to the fighting today. Sarah nodded, though her face was still pale. I'm fine, she said. Just shaken. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. He held her tight, finding comfort in her presence, a small island of calm in the storm of uncertainty that surrounded them. Later that night, long after Ethan had fallen asleep, Sarah slipped out of the shack. The moon was a sliver in the inky sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the yard. She walked towards the barn, drawn by the faint glow of a lantern. She found Maggie inside, hunched over a makeshift table, her face illuminated by the lamplight. Maggie was stripped to the waist, her back turned to Sarah. Sarah could see a dark stain spreading across her shoulder, a bullet wound that she had been trying to conceal. Maggie flinched as Sarah approached, quickly pulling her shirt back on. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice sharp, defensive. Sarah didn't reply, just stood there, her eyes filled with concern. "Let me help you," she said softly. Maggie hesitated, then sighed, her tough facade crumbling. "It's just a scratch," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Sarah stepped closer, gently pushing Maggie's shirt aside. The wound was worse than she had imagined, a deep gash that had been poorly bandaged. "You need to clean this," she said, her voice firm, "and stitch it properly." Maggie didn't argue, just nodded slowly. Sarah fetched water and bandages, and together they cleaned and dressed the wound. As Sarah worked, Maggie remained silent, her face etched with pain. When they were finished, Sarah sat beside Maggie, the silence stretching between them. Finally, Maggie spoke, her voice low and strained. "It's Callahan," she said. "He wants our farm." Sarah looked at her, her eyes filled with understanding. "The land baron?" Maggie nodded. "He claims my father owed him money. He says we have to pay him back, or he'll take the farm." "But you don't have the money," Sarah said, stating the obvious. "No," Maggie replied, her voice bitter. "We don't. That's why we were taking the cattle to market. We were hoping to sell them for enough to pay him off." "And the gold?" Sarah asked, remembering Ethan's question. Maggie hesitated, then sighed. "My father hid some gold before he died," she said. "It's all we have left." "And Callahan knows about it?" "He suspects," Maggie replied. "He's been pressuring us, threatening us. He sent those riders today to scare us, to force us to give up." Sarah nodded, understanding dawning. "That's why you didn't want Ethan to know," she said. "You were afraid he'd try to take the gold for himself." Maggie looked at Sarah, her eyes filled with shame. "I didn't know him," she said. "I didn't know if I could trust him." Sarah reached out and took Maggie's hand, her touch gentle, reassuring. "I understand," she said. "Trust is hard to come by in this land." She paused, then spoke again, her voice soft, vulnerable. "My husband, he died of fever. Left me with nothing. I lost my home, everything. I came west looking for a new start, a new life." Maggie looked at Sarah, her eyes filled with compassion. For the first time, the barrier between them seemed to dissolve, replaced by a shared understanding, a common bond forged in the crucible of hardship and loss. They were both women who had been broken by life, forced to fight for every inch of ground they claimed. The silence returned, heavier now, filled with unspoken grief and a fragile hope. Ethan watched them from the shadows of the shack the next morning, the rising sun painting the landscape in hues of gold and amber. He saw Sarah and Maggie working side by side, mending fences, their movements synchronized, their conversations hushed but animated. He saw a connection forming between them, a bond of shared experience and mutual respect. A knot of unease tightened in his gut. He had brought Sarah here to protect her, to give her a fresh start. But he was beginning to realize that he couldn't protect her from everything, that the West had a way of shaping people, of forging them in the fires of adversity. He had wanted to shield her from the harsh realities of this defiant, but she was finding her own strength, her own resilience, in the company of these women. He saw a flicker of happiness in her eyes, a lightness in her step that he hadn't seen since before her husband died. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he couldn't take that away from her. He couldn't shelter her forever. He walked towards them, his boots crunching on the dry earth. As he approached, Maggie glanced up, her expression guarded. She smiled, her eyes radiating warmth. "Morning," Ethan said, his voice low and even. "Morning," Sarah replied, her voice bright. "Maggie's been showing me how to mend fences." Ethan nodded, his gaze lingering on Maggie. "Anything I can do to help?" Maggie hesitated, then shook her head. "We've got it covered," she said, her voice curt. Ethan didn't press, sensing her unease. He knew she was still wary of him, that the trust between them was fragile, easily broken. He spent the rest of the day working on the farm, his movements methodical, his thoughts troubled. He kept a watchful eye on the horizon, his senses on high alert. He knew Callahan wouldn't give up easily, that he would be back, sooner or later. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, a lone rider appeared in the distance, a dark silhouette, against the fiery sky. Ethan recognized him instantly. Callahan. He watched as Callahan approached, his face a mask of cold indifference. He rode a magnificent black stallion, its muscles rippling beneath its sleek coat. He was dressed in expensive clothes, his boots polished to a mirror sheen, a stark contrast to the rough and tumble attire of the homesteaders. Callahan reined in his horse a few yards away, his eyes sweeping over the farm, taking in the dilapidated shack, the mended fence, the meager herd of cattle. He dismounted slowly, deliberately, his movements exuding an air of power and control. "Maggie," he said, his voice smooth and menacing. "We need to talk." Callahan's words hung in the air, a viper's hiss in the twilight. Maggie stiffened, her hand instinctively reaching for the rifle leaning against the fence post. Her sisters mirrored her movement, their faces hardening with grim determination. Ethan stood motionless, his gaze fixed on Callahan. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face, a shadow of recognition, quickly masked by a stoic resolve. He knew this man. He knew him better than he cared to admit. "There's nothing to talk about, Callahan," Maggie said, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "You've said your piece, now get off my land." Callahan chuckled, a loose, grating sound that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. He gestured to his men, a half-dozen hardened cowboys, their faces etched with years of violence and disregard. "Now, Maggie, is that any way to talk to a creditor?" Callahan drawled. "I've been patient, but my patience is wearing thin. Your father owed me a considerable sum, and I intend to collect. Either you pay up, or you pack your bags and leave. This land is mine now." Maggie spat on the ground. "This land is ours. We worked for it, bled for it. My father earned it fair and square." "Fair and square?" Callahan scoffed. "Your father was a gambler, a drunk, and a cheat. He mortgaged this farm to me years ago. The debt is long overdue." Ethan finally moved, stepping forward, placing himself between Callahan and the women. His eyes, usually calm and steady, were now like chips of flint. "This doesn't concern you, stranger," Callahan said, his gaze narrowing. "Step aside." Ethan didn't flinch. He stood his ground, a silent sentinel. "It concerns me," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "These women are under my protection." Callahan's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. He studied Ethan more closely, his gaze lingering on the set of his jaw, the way he carried himself. "Ethan?" he said, his voice laced with disbelief. "Is that you, boy?" The air crackled with tension. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Maggie and her sisters exchanged bewildered glances. Ethan's face remained impassive. "Silas," he acknowledged, the name a cold, hard stone on his tongue. Callahan, Silas, dismounted completely, tossing the reins to one of his men. He took a step closer to Ethan, his eyes searching his face. "After all these years," he said, a strange mixture of anger and something akin to pride in his voice. "You've grown into a man, a stubborn one, I see." "I left for a reason, Silas," Ethan said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I wanted nothing to do with you or your methods." "Family is family, Ethan," Silas said, his voice softening slightly. "Blood is thicker than honor." "Not when that blood is stained with lies and truculence," Ethan countered, his voice hardening. Silas's face darkened. "You always were a sanctimonious fool, boy, just like your mother." Ethan's hand tightened into a fist, but he remained silent. He wouldn't give Silas the satisfaction of a reaction. "These women owe me a debt," Silas continued, his voice regaining its edge. "And I intend to collect." "Step aside, Ethan. This is between me and them." Ethan stood firm, his gaze unwavering. "They don't owe you anything," he said, "and you're not taking this farm." The setting sun bled across the sky, mirroring the simmering race in Silas's eyes. He spat on the parched earth, the gesture a crude punctuation mark to his simmering fury. "You always were a disappointment, Ethan, turning your back on family, on what's rightfully ours." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Rightfully ours? This ain't yours, Silas. You built your empire on the backs of others, on lies and intimidation. This land, these women, they earned it." Silas laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that echoed across the desolate landscape. "Earned it? They're weak, Ethan, helpless. They need someone strong to protect them, to guide them. Like you need me." Ethan shook his head, a weariness settling over him. He knew arguing with Silas was like trying to reason with a rabid dog. There was no reaching him, no appealing to his sense of decency. "Get off this land, Silas," Ethan said, his voice low and dangerous, "before things get ugly." Silas's eyes narrowed. He glanced at his men, a silent command passing between them. The cowboys shifted, their hands hovering near their holstered revolvers. "You're making a mistake, Ethan," Silas said, his voice laced with a chilling calm. "You're choosing them over your own flesh and blood." "I'm choosing what's right," Ethan replied, his hand instinctively moving towards the Colt peacemaker strapped to his thigh. The air hung thick with anticipation. Sarah watched, her heart pounding in her chest, fear coiling in her gut. She knew what was coming. She had seen it in Ethan's eyes, in the way he stood, his body coiled like a spring ready to unleash. A single crow cawed overhead, the sound a mournful dirge. Then, the silence shattered. One of Silas's men drew his gun, a reckless act of bravado. Ethan reacted instantly, his draw lightning fast. A shot rang out, echoing across the plains. The cowboy crumpled to the ground, clutching his keister. Chaos erupted. Guns blazed, spitting fire and lead. Maggie and her sisters scrambled for cover, diving behind the shack, their own rifles barking in defiance. Ethan moved with a speed and precision, born of years of experience. He ducked, weaved, and fired, his shots finding their mark with deadly accuracy. Men fell screaming, writhing in pain. Silas stood his ground, his face a mask of fury. He drew his own revolver, a silver-plated Colt, and aimed it at Ethan. "You can't win this, boy," he roared above the din of gunfire. "You're outnumbered." Ethan knew Silas was right. He was outgunned, outmanned. But he wouldn't back down. He couldn't. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. He aimed his own revolver at Silas, his finger tightening on the trigger. He knew what he had to do. He had to stop Silas, even if it meant. He fired. The bullet struck Silas in the shoulder, spinning him around. He stumbled, dropping his revolver. A look of shock and disbelief crossed his face. Ethan lowered his gun, his hand trembling. He had done it. He had shot his own father. The gunfire subsided, replaced by an eerie silence. Silas's men, stunned by their leader's injury, hesitated, unsure what to do. Ethan stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Silas. "Get off this land, Silas," he said, his voice hoarse, "and don't ever come back." Silas stared at Ethan, his eyes filled with hatred and betrayal. "You're dead to me, boy," he spat, his voice thick with venom. "You're no son of mine." He turned and limped towards his horse, his men scrambling to help him. They mounted up and rode off, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Ethan watched them go, his heart heavy with grief and regret. He had saved Maggie and her sisters, but he had lost his father in the process. He knew he could never go back, that he had severed the last ties to his past. He turned to face Maggie and Sarah, their faces etched with relief and gratitude. But he saw something else in their eyes, a mixture of fear and apprehension. They had seen what he was capable of, the darkness that lurked beneath his stoic exterior. He had protected them, but at what cost? He had become the very thing he had always despised, a man of violence. He had saved their farm, but he had damned his own soul. The silence that followed Silas's departure was thick, suffocating. The acrid smell of gunpowder hung in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of blood. Maggie and her sisters slowly emerged from behind the shack, their faces pale and drawn. They cautiously approached Ethan, their eyes filled with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Sarah was the first to reach him. She rushed forward, throwing her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. "Thank you, Ethan," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for saving us." Ethan stiffened slightly, unused to such open displays of affection. He awkwardly patted her back, his gaze drifting towards Maggie and her sisters. He saw the gratitude in their eyes, but also a lingering fear. He knew he had revealed a side of himself that they hadn't seen before, a darkness that had been forged in the crucible of his past. He gently disengaged himself from Sarah's embrace. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gruff. Maggie nodded, her expression softening. "We're fine, thanks to you." She glanced at the fallen cowboy, his body lying still in the dirt. We'll take care of him." Ethan nodded, understanding. He knew the unspoken code of the West. You bury your dead and move on. There was no time for mourning, no time for regret, only survival. He felt a sharp pain in his side, a searing reminder of the battle that had just taken place. He reached down and touched his ribs, his fingers coming away stained with blood. Sarah gasped. "You're hurt." Ethan shrugged. "It's just a scratch." But Sarah wouldn't hear of it. She insisted on tending to his wound, leading him inside the shack. Maggie and her sisters followed, their movements efficient and purposeful. They cleaned and bandaged his side, their touch surprisingly gentle. As Sarah worked, her eyes met Ethan's. He saw a depth of understanding in her gaze, a recognition of the burden he carried. She didn't judge him for his violence, didn't recoil from the darkness within him. She saw the sacrifice he had made, the price he had paid to protect them. "You didn't have to do that, Ethan," she said softly, her voice filled with compassion. "You didn't have to risk your life for us." Ethan looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "I couldn't stand by and watch him take everything you've worked for," he mumbled. Sarah placed her hand on his cheek, turning his face towards her. "I know," she said, "and I'll never forget it." The night passed slowly. The women kept a vigil, their rifles close at hand, listening for any sign of Silas's return. But he didn't come. The West was a vast and unforgiving place, and even a mouse like Silas knew when he was beaten, at least for now. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky, Ethan stepped outside the shack. The farm was scarred, but it still stood. The fences were broken. The ground was churned up, but the spirit of the land remained unbroken. He saw Maggie and her sisters tending to the animals, their movements methodical and determined. They were survivors, forged in the fires of adversity. They wouldn't be broken. Sarah joined him, her face etched with a quiet strength. She took his hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "We'll rebuild," she said, her voice filled with hope. "We'll make this place our own." Ethan looked at her, his heart filled with a newfound sense of peace. He had come to this place seeking solace, seeking escape from his past. But he had found something more, a purpose, a connection, a reason to keep fighting. The West was still wild, still dangerous, but it was also a place of hope, a place of resilience, a place where even the most broken souls could find healing and redemption. And as he looked out over the land, bathed in the golden light of dawn, he knew that he had finally found his home. The sun, a molten coin in the vast azure sky, spilled across the wounded land. Ethan leaned against the weathered fence, the rough wood a familiar comfort beneath his calloused hands. The ache in his side was a dull throb, a constant reminder of the previous night's violence. But it was a small price to pay for the quiet he now witnessed. Maggie, her sleeves rolled up, her brow furrowed in concentration, carefully transplanted seedlings into the rich soil. Sarah, humming a wordless tune, watered the young plants with a gentle hand. Their movements were fluid, practiced, a testament to years spent coaxing life from the unforgiving earth. Their laughter, carried on the gentle breeze, was a melody that soothed the raw edges of his soul. He watched them, these women he had barely known a week ago, yet felt bound to now by something stronger than blood. They were rebuilding, brick by painstaking brick, the life that Silas had tried to steal. The broken fences were being mended, the bullet-scarred shack slowly repaired. The fallen cowboy lay buried in an unmarked grave on the far side of the property, a silent testament to the brutal realities of survival in this land. The memory of Silas, his father, lingered like a bitter taste in Ethan's mouth. He had severed that tie, perhaps irrevocably. But looking at Maggie and Sarah, he knew he had made the right choice. Family wasn't always about shared blood. It was about shared burdens, shared dreams, and the unwavering loyalty forged in the fires of adversity. Sarah caught his eye and smiled, a radiant, genuine smile that chased away the shadows lurking in his heart. She gestured towards the garden with her watering can. "Come help us, Ethan," she called out, her voice bright and clear. "There's plenty to do." He hesitated for a moment, the weight of his past threatening to anchor him to the spot. But then he pushed himself away from the fence, the sunlight warming his face. He walked towards them, towards the promise of a new beginning. He knelt beside Maggie, accepting a handful of seedlings. The cool earth clung to his fingers, a tangible connection to the land he was now a part of. He looked at Maggie, at Sarah, their faces alight with hope, and he knew that he had found something precious here, something worth fighting for. The West would always be unforgiving, a land of dust and hardship, where survival was a daily battle. But even in the harshest landscapes, a little mercy could bloom, a fragile flower, pushing its way through the cracked earth. Sometimes, all it took was one person to stand up, to offer a helping hand, to plant a seed of hope in the face of despair. And sometimes, that was enough. The wind whispered through the tall grassy twigs, carrying the scent of wildflowers and the promise of rain. Ethan planted the seedling in the earth, his hands rough but gentle. He looked up at the vast, endless sky, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. He was home,